Everyone. Sorry about that. I think yeah, whoever was hosting the lecture had to go early and they accidentally closed the meeting. But yeah, okay. I'll kind of just continue from where I left off. We're nearly done with like the programming part. It's a bit of a long lecture this time. But yeah, okay. So the important thing to know about combined expressions is you want to go from the innermost condition outwards. So that's why I evaluated the 1 plus 2 equals 3 first, and then alongside the 5 times 6 equals 31 first. Yeah. And then after this, now we're kind of going outwards. Negation false equals true, and then you have this final statement of true and true, which will evaluate to true. Yeah, okay. So now we'll kind of go into conditional statements. The important thing to know about conditional statements is you have these two conditions, basically, if and else. So if will basically, you'll go into the if condition if the expression that you give for the if statement evaluates to true. If it evaluates to false, then you go into the else expression. And yeah, okay, so this is like important JavaScript notation. A condition is an expression that evaluates to true or false. So yeah, you put it inside parentheses next to the if keyword, and after that you're going to have these curly braces. It's kind of similar to the format of a function, and the behavior that you'll include when the condition is true will be placed inside here, inside the curly braces rather, sorry. Yeah, so this is kind of an example of a function with if statements. So yeah, the function is going to be number equal. You're checking if the number, the variable passed into the function is equal to a certain number. So in this case, it'll go into the uppermost if statement and check is the number equals 5. And in this case, if you pass in the number 5 to the function number equal, it will evaluate to true. So the console will log numbers equal to 5. If the number 4 is passed into the function, then this first statement, if statement, it's going to fail the expression. Like this expression 4 equals 5 evaluates to false. So it'll like not enter the if statement. It'll go to the next, whatever is next. And in this case, is 4 greater than 4? That's still false. So it's not going to go into this if statement. It's actually not going to do anything in this case. Yeah. If 3 is passed into the function, it's actually going to be the same thing. Yeah. Oh, wait, actually, sorry, I missed this. When the number 5 is passed into the function, as I said, it'll go into the first if statement, and then it'll like print out numbers equal to 5 into the console. But in this case, because you have 2 if statements, it's still going to go into the second if statement. And because 5 is greater than 4, it is also going to print out numbers greater than 4 into the console. Whereas in this case, this is what I kind of mixed up. When 5 is passed into the function, it's going to go into the first if statement because 5 is equal to 5, and it's going to print out this line. But because we have an else statement here instead of another if, because we've gone into the if statement here, we're no longer going to go into this part. The else statement will only be entered if the expression here evaluates to false. And yeah, so one final thing is we're kind of like adding a bit more complexity. You have this else if statement, which is kind of like a combination. You're gonna, in this case, when you pass in when you pass in 5 to this function, it's going to go into the first if statement and print this line, number is equal to 5. And then it's not going to do anything else because it's entered the if statement, and the other the function or else's. And because we've entered the first if statement, then it's done. Whereas 6, if you pass in 6 into this function, then it's not going to go into the first if statement because 6 equals 5 evaluates to false. And it's going to enter the second if statement here. It's going to be like, no, the first one evaluates to false, so we can't do that. The second one evaluates to true because 6 is greater than 4, so it's going to print out this line. And just like before, it's not going to go into the else statement because it's entered the if statement already. And then the final example is 4. It's going to evaluate, the first expression is going to evaluate to false. The second expression is also going to evaluate to false because 4 is not greater than 4. And it's going to be like, okay, false, false, the else statement. When you go into the else statement, and in this case, it's going to output this line, number is less than 5. Yeah. So I believe that is everything we wanted to cover today, like event handling and conditionals. I believe lab and homework will kind of delve more into these two things. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to speak up now. Like you can enter it in the chat, or you can turn on your microphone and ask. Okay, if there are no questions, we'll take a 5-minute break and then do design lecture. As always, if you have any questions about the lab or homework, feel free to come to office hours. Just make sure some TAs and instructors want an email in advance, so just make sure you are aware of that if you're planning to go to their office hours.
Hi, we can start again for the design lecture. Let me share my screen. Cool, so this week we'll be covering accessibility, in particular accessible design. So what is accessibility? Accessibility refers to the practice of building digital content and applications that can be used by a wide range of people, including individuals who have visual, motor, auditory, speech, or cognitive disabilities. And we'll learn that throughout this lecture that accessibility isn't actually limited to just digital content, but it applies to a lot of other design too. And it's also not just for people with disabilities, but I think framing it in this way is a good way to start thinking about designing for accessibility. And this article that this quote is from is a really good summary of some of the content that we'll cover in class. So I guess first, why is accessibility important? We kind of covered this in that slide, but also nearly, I think 1 in 5 people in the US have a disability. And so it's really important that we do create inclusive and accessible designs. So how can we design for accessibility? So here's an example of something that you might think of when you think of disability or accessibility. And it's something that a lot of people use. Yeah, so this is a wheelchair. And when we think of designing for wheelchairs, we often think of making sure that there's enough space or that there's ramps instead of just stairs. And that's mostly for a physical spatial sense, right? But not all people with disabilities use wheelchairs, right? There's so many different ways that people might have disabilities that like it doesn't make sense to only design for wheelchairs. And it actually turns out that like wheelchairs aren't even the most accessible. They're actually designed for like able bodies rather than like really designed for the people who actually use them. So, and this is like, I think Asia, who was a past instructor, these are like all from her experiences. And so she said that working with people who used wheelchairs, she found that they could often exacerbate the feelings of dependency because like you see that there's like handlebars. So it often feels like, oh, they might need someone to like push them around to get to places. Or like if you look at where the storage pouches are, so like the two pictures on the left, there's like the bag on the back and then the like area underneath. You'll notice that like for a lot of people who are in wheelchairs, this isn't the like most easily accessible. So like it can be difficult for them to move their bodies, like reaching behind them or reaching underneath them. So like yeah, wheelchair design isn't the best. Also like they're bulky, they're difficult to store. And so all of these factors may contribute to them like feeling like they have to depend on others. And it can be really difficult for them to live their lives like comfortably or healthily. Yeah, so that's wheelchairs. And I think like the main takeaway from that is that we don't want people to design just based off of assumptions. Um, like we want, oh, sorry. I'm like in public because I was just in a meeting. You can try to speak louder, but I think it should be quieter now too. Um, is it better? I'm just gonna continue then. Okay, yeah. We shouldn't design based off like assumptions that we make, right? Because like if we're not wheelchair users, like we don't really understand what it's like. So it's important for us to really empathize with the people we're designing for. So if we do a quick thought experiment, this is from a designer's experience of visiting her blind friend. And so she I guess like we can go through the thought experiment first, but imagine the power goes out and you don't have your phone or like any form of light that you could use. So what like objects or machines or things in your house would be the hardest to use without light? Um, does anyone want to like say something in chat or? Um, if no one has any like input, I think for me, it would probably be things that have like labels on them. Or if you think about like a microwave, like so many microwaves have different orders of their buttons, right? Some have like popcorn buttons, some have like just the numbers. Um, and you don't know if the numbers, start at the bottom, if they start at the top. So things like that, where like a lot of the use or like being able to use these devices require being able to see. These would be really difficult to use. And this was from the designer's experience of visiting her blind friend. Um, and she really struggled because, her friend didn't need to turn on the lights because, that's how she like goes through life. But yeah, she really struggled. And then we have another thought experiment. So imagine instead that there's a divider that you can't see through that goes between you and your phone or computer. So what would be the hardest to do on your device then? And I think like if we frame that in terms of like web, the hardest thing would be knowing where to click, right? Like we can see where we want to click, we can see how the navigation bar looks. But if you can't see, how do you navigate through the pages? So I guess like with these, we really just want to encourage you to step outside of your own experience and really try to empathize with others, especially those that you're designing for. As designers, we're often like drawing from our own experiences and our like background, or from like people we know really well, right? But when designing for people who are different from us, we need to like put aside our own biases and our own experiences, and like truly empathize and understand their needs and their problems. Um, and then also like having their voices and feedback like incorporated into the design, making sure that they're heard, making sure that they feel like seen. Yeah, so how do we incorporate this into web design? So here's an example from Among Us. I guess this is not as web design focused, but like in general, you'll see that previously in the left picture, all the colors are basically like the same saturation. They're all really bright, but for a colorblind person, it may be difficult to tell the different colors apart. So with their, I think, update a while back, they actually changed the colors a bit, I think. But more importantly, they added symbols, and these symbols help people who were visually impaired or struggled with I guess being able to tell the colors apart to also enjoy the game as much as everyone else. Yeah. Similarly, we have forms. Like so often we fill things out in forms. And you'll see that on the left, there's like these text boxes that have the light text inside that like kind of gives an example of what you might want to fill out inside the box, right? But actually, like when people use screen readers or like voice to text or text to voice, sorry, the devices won't actually read out these light gray text. And also they can be difficult to read for even just like people who are visually impaired. So while you can include them, like we encourage you to also make these accessible. So the thing on the left, the image on the left is like slightly better because it still does have like the questions above the text boxes, but we have to make sure that everything is properly like associated. Sorry, I don't know why the slides keep changing. Associated with the inputs. So making sure that they know that this box that we're supposed to fill in is related to this specific question. And then also with um, with forms, there's other problems. So when we have inputs, like if you were to fill out a form and you filled in like your phone number incorrectly, right? It was formatted wrong or something. How do people know which input was the one that actually created the error that prevented you from being able to submit the form? So those are all things that you have to consider when you're designing for people who might not be accessing our websites visually, who might be using accessibility devices like VoiceOver on Mac, these different text-to-speech devices that help them navigate. And then I guess like going off of that, that's why we encourage people to include alt text. So alt text is a description of like the images that you're showing. And these images will be read out by the screen readers that people are using. So without alt text, people might hear, oh, like this is the text that's in our paragraph and then image. And having just something read out image really doesn't tell you anything, right? If you were just to hear image, like you wouldn't be able to understand what was actually shown in that image. So by including alt text, that gives something for the screen readers to read, so that people who use these devices are also able to understand what's going on in the picture. Yeah, and then I guess like sometimes there's also the possibility that like things just don't read images, which is also why alt text is important. And then I think like from my experience, it's especially important to include this or like different accessibility attributes and properties when you have icons, right? So if you have I don't know, like if we look on Zoom and there's the mute icon, but it's a microphone. If the screen reader just read image, like how are you supposed to know what that button does? So like with these buttons, especially if they're only symbols, you have to make sure that we do provide the necessary like descriptions and attributes and alt text to make it accessible for people to use. Also with HTML, it's important that you use nav and main, as these help people who use the keyboard to navigate, to like really understand where different parts of the page are, so that they can go from, the navigation bar and jump directly to the main content, rather than having to like press arrow or tab to reach like each different part of the page. Like it can be really overwhelming to listen to every link that is on a website, especially like imagine being on like a news site where there's like not only a navigation bar, but also like 20 different articles. Like how do you get to where you want? So it's important to have these sorts of like semantic tags that help the users differentiate. Yeah, so I guess like with that, we just really want to emphasize that navigation is not something that we think about very often, right? Like we just use our trackpad most of the time, or a mouse, and that really allows us to access anywhere on the page. But with people who use their laptops in ways different from ours, or people who need to use screen readers, they often have to navigate with their keyboard. So things like tab, the arrow keys, space. And so these are things that we need to take into consideration when we design. So designing inclusively isn't just about disability. It's also making sure that people feel welcome. So if you've had experiences filling out forms, maybe for the doctors or registering for like exams or registering for school, you'll see that there's often questions that ask like for your ethnic group. And people, obviously like America and everywhere around the world, like is really diverse. So having these like single radio buttons where people can select one group that they identify with can feel very othering, right? Or even just having like the other button, like why didn't I get included? So like making sure that all the content we put on our page is also there to make people feel like they belong. And that can also apply to things like sexuality or other like things that people identify as. Yeah, so with accessibility and like designing for it, we really have to think about who we are considering and who we, are excluding, who we aren't like making sure that we're designing for. And this is because, again, the world includes such a diverse array of backgrounds, experiences, and identities that need to be considered when we're trying to make inclusive designs. So yeah, a question that companies often think about is how easy is it for anyone to use our product? And I think that's a question that we should all think about when we're designing. Yeah, so here are some suggestions to design inclusively. Some of the resources we have are Color Oracle, which simulates like color blindness for Windows. Web AIM checks like the contrast of your text to your background. Contrast is also there to check the contrast. And then there's this Chrome extension that tests the site for accessibility violations. So I believe like there's a group that like focuses especially on having these different accessibility standards. So like having alt text, having buttons and forms that are accessible to people who use screen readers or who navigate through their keyboard. So yeah, there's like the extension that helps you test for that if you're interested. Yeah, so I guess like the last thing is that we just really want to emphasize that part of designing accessibly is to like being able to empathize with other people, and being able to understand, their experiences, their backgrounds, their needs, and just like making sure that you try to learn as much as you can about others. And then also being able to stay creative and like think about how can we redesign this to be more inclusive, and to support the needs of more people. Yeah. Are there any questions? Feel free to leave them in the chat. If not, that's all that we have for this week. So if you haven't yet, you should hopefully receive a not homework, your grade report soon. And yeah, thanks for coming.